All right, folks, Ted Hartwell here, retired ranger, and I'm going to break this down the way we'd brief it in the talk. On January 16, 2026, Canada signed a trade deal with China. Now, most people saw this as a routine agricultural negotiation: canola seeds, electric vehicles, the usual trade minutiae. But if you step back and look at this from an operational perspective, what you're actually seeing is the first major crack in North America's economic perimeter. The core question on everyone's mind should be this: is America's northern flank, our most secure economic border for over a century, starting to shift its orientation toward Beijing? Why now? Because for the past year, Washington has been squeezing Ottawa with tariffs, threatening their sovereignty, and treating our closest ally like a hostile actor. When you push someone hard enough, eventually they start looking for other partners. That's not politics. That's physics. Let me frame the risk here in clear terms. This isn't just about canola or electric vehicles. This is about the architecture of North American economic security. For decades, the United States operated on the assumption that Canada was a locked-in partner, geographically contained, economically dependent, and strategically aligned. That assumption allowed us to focus our trade pressure elsewhere while treating the northern border as a secure rear area. What we're witnessing now is the beginning of a potential strategic realignment. Canada is the top export destination for 36 American states. Not China, not Mexico, Canada. If Ottawa diversifies its trade relationships and reduces its dependence on the U.S. market, Washington loses leverage. And in the world of economic statecraft, leverage is everything. Let's look at the terrain. The geography of North American trade is deceptively simple but strategically critical. 60% of America's crude oil imports come from Canada. That's not Saudi Arabia. That's not Venezuela. That's Alberta. 85% of our electricity imports cross the Canadian border. Every single day, $1.9 billion in goods and services move between our two countries. That's not trade. That's an integrated supply chain so deeply embedded that separating it would be like trying to remove the circulatory system from a living body. The Ambassador Bridge between Windsor and Detroit alone handles more trade volume than all U.S.-Japan commerce combined. When people in Washington talk about decoupling from foreign supply chains, they need to understand that Canada is not some distant trading partner. It's the other half of our industrial base. Now let's examine the Chinese position. Beijing has been playing a patient game. After Canada imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in 2024, mirroring Washington's policy, China retaliated hard. They slapped 100% tariffs on Canadian canola oil, 76% on canola seed, 25% on pork and seafood. The Canadian agricultural sector, particularly in Saskatchewan and Alberta, was hemorrhaging. Chinese imports of Canadian goods dropped over 10% in 2025. Beijing knew exactly what it was doing. It was creating pressure on Ottawa, knowing that eventually the Canadians would need to choose between American alignment and economic survival. This January, Prime Minister Carney flew to Beijing, the first Canadian PM to visit China since 2017, and came back with a deal. China gets 49,000 electric vehicles into the Canadian market at 6.1% tariff. Canada gets its agricultural exports back. That's a classic capability for capability exchange, and it tells you everything about where each side's leverage actually sits. Here's what the deal actually contains, and I want to be precise because the details matter. Canada will allow 49,000 Chinese-made EVs annually at a tariff rate of 6.1%. Down from the punitive 100% rate imposed in 2024. By 2030, half of those vehicles must be priced under $35,000 Canadian, which means affordable EVs flooding the market. In exchange, China drops its canola seed tariff from 84% to approximately 15% by March 1st. Tariffs on canola meal, lobsters, crabs, and peas get removed until at least the end of 2026. Canada also extended remissions on certain Chinese steel and aluminum products that are in short supply domestically. The deal unlocks roughly $3 billion in Canadian agricultural exports. Now, 49,000 vehicles might sound small. It's less than 3% of Canada's auto market, but this is a wedge. It's designed to grow. Carney himself indicated the quota will increase about 6% annually, potentially reaching 70,000 vehicles within 5 years. This is how you open a door that doesn't close. Trump's response was immediate and predictable. On January 24th, he posted on Truth Social threatening a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods if Ottawa proceeds with the China deal. He called Prime Minister Carney Governor Carney, a deliberate insult implying Canada should become America's 51st state. He accused Canada of becoming a drop-off port for Chinese goods entering the United States. Now, here's where we need to separate intent from capability. Trump has made hundreds of tariff threats over the past year. Many of them were walked back after market reactions or business community pushback. The question isn't whether Trump wants to impose 100% tariffs on Canada. It's whether he can sustain the economic and political consequences of actually doing it. If scenario A plays out and Trump follows through, you're looking at the most severe trade disruption in North American history. Canada would almost certainly retaliate, potentially cutting energy exports, which would spike American heating and gasoline prices immediately. If scenario B plays out and Trump backs down, as he has on previous threats, then the signal to the world is clear. American tariff threats are negotiating theater, not credible commitments. Either outcome weakens Washington's position. The institutional friction here is significant, and it's not getting enough attention. The USMCA, the trade agreement that replaced NAFTA, is scheduled for a joint review in July 2026. That review was supposed to be a routine process, but now it's going to become a battlefield. Canada has already demonstrated that it's willing to look elsewhere for trade partners. The leverage Washington thought it had going into that negotiation just got substantially reduced. Meanwhile, there are at least 5 court cases challenging Trump's use of emergency tariff authority under IEPA. No court has yet ruled in favor of unlimited presidential tariff power, though appeals are ongoing. The Supreme Court could issue a ruling on tariff legality at any point. If scenario A occurs and the courts constrain tariff authority, Trump loses his primary economic weapon. If scenario B occurs and the courts defer to executive power, you'll see tariffs weaponized even further. But that doesn't mean they'll be effective. Legal authority and economic efficacy are two different things. Let's talk about the US-China dimension, because this triangle has 3 corners, not 2. Right now, there's a fragile trade truce between Washington and Beijing. Tariffs on Chinese goods are sitting around 47.5%, down from peaks above 100% during the spring 2025 escalation. Trump is scheduled to visit China in April 2026, followed by a reciprocal Xi visit later in the year. Both sides are trying to maintain stability ahead of those summits. But the Canada situation complicates this calculus. If Trump imposes 100% tariffs on Canada to punish the China deal, Beijing will interpret that as indirect pressure on Chinese trade interests. China has already stated it will take all necessary measures to defend its interests if tariff escalation resumes. The Canadian deal gives China a beachhead in North America, even if it's small. If that beachhead grows, it changes the economic geography of the continent. Washington's Fortress North America strategy assumed that both Canada and Mexico would remain inside the American economic perimeter. Canada just demonstrated that assumption may no longer hold. So what are the concrete consequences if this trajectory continues? First, energy security. Canada supplies 60% of American crude oil imports and 85% of electricity imports. Any serious trade conflict puts those flows at risk. We're not talking about hypothetical supply chain disruptions. We're talking about gasoline prices, heating bills, and industrial power costs going up for American households and businesses. Second, manufacturing integration. The North American auto industry is not American, Canadian, or Mexican. It's continental. Parts cross the border multiple times before a single vehicle is assembled. Tariffs on Canadian goods don't just hit Canadian producers. They hit American assembly lines that depend on Canadian components. Third, agricultural markets. American farmers sell more to Canada than to any other country. If Canada retaliates with its own tariffs, or simply redirects its purchasing toward other suppliers, American agricultural exports lose their largest market. The domino effects ripple through rural America. Now let's talk about the broader diplomatic fallout. Other U.S. allies are watching this situation very closely. The European Union has been under similar tariff pressure from Washington. Japan and South Korea face their own trade tensions with the Trump administration. If Canada successfully pivots toward China without catastrophic consequences, it creates a template for others to follow. The EU in particular has been exploring ways to reduce dependence on American markets while expanding ties with Asia. Germany's industrial base, already struggling, might see Chinese partnerships as a survival mechanism rather than a strategic risk. The message being sent right now is that American alliance relationships are transactional, not structural. Allies can be squeezed, and when allies get squeezed hard enough, they start looking for alternatives. That's not a theoretical concern anymore. It's happening on America's own border. For American consumers and businesses, the timeline to watch is the next 6 to 12 months. March 1st is when the Canadian-Chinese tariff changes take effect. That's when Chinese canola tariffs drop and agricultural exports resume. April is the planned Trump-Xi summit in Beijing. The tone and outcome of that meeting will signal whether the U.S.-China truce holds or fractures. July is the USMCA review, which will now be conducted in an atmosphere of mutual suspicion rather than partnership. Throughout this period, watch for signals on energy flows. Any disruption to Canadian oil or electricity exports would hit American markets within days, not weeks. Watch for automotive supply chain announcements. If companies start shifting production or sourcing to avoid tariff exposure, that's a structural change, not a temporary adjustment. And watch for other countries making their own moves. If the EU, Japan, or South Korea start cutting their own deals with China while American tariff threats are active, the isolation won't be China's. It'll be America's. Here are the specific indicators I'll be monitoring, and you should be too. First, watch Canadian energy export data. If volumes to the U.S. start declining while exports to Asia increase, that's a fundamental shift in continental energy flows. Second, watch Chinese EV sales in Canada. The initial 49,000 quota is small, but if consumer demand exceeds that quota, expect pressure to expand it rapidly. Third, watch for joint venture announcements. The deal includes language about Chinese investment in Canadian EV manufacturing and supply chains. If BYD, CATL, or other Chinese firms announce Canadian facilities, that's Beijing establishing a manufacturing footprint in North America. Fourth, watch Trump's actual tariff implementation versus his threats. A pattern of threats followed by retreat signals declining credibility. A pattern of threats followed by implementation signals escalation. Fifth, watch the USMCA review process. If Canada or Mexico starts requesting modifications that reduce American advantages, the trilateral framework is under stress. Sixth, watch European and Asian trade announcements. Similar deals to what Canada just signed would indicate a broader realignment away from American economic leadership. The strategic picture here is uncomfortable but necessary to articulate. For over a century, America's northern border has been the most secure frontier in the world. No military threat, no economic competition, deeply integrated supply chains, shared values and institutions. That security was never guaranteed by geography alone. It was maintained by a relationship of mutual benefit and respect. What we're seeing now is that relationship being tested in ways it hasn't been tested since the War of 1812. Canada isn't becoming an adversary, but it is becoming a country that hedges its bets. And in strategic terms, an ally that hedges is an ally that's no longer fully aligned. The Canada-China deal is not a betrayal. It's a rational response to American pressure. Ottawa looked at its options, assessed its vulnerabilities, and decided that economic diversification was necessary for national survival. That's exactly what any competent government would do. The question for Washington is whether this outcome was the intended goal of tariff policy, or whether it's an unintended consequence that undermines the very security those tariffs were supposed to provide. Here's the bottom line. Canada's trade deal with China is the first significant crack in North America's economic perimeter. It was caused not by Chinese aggression or Canadian betrayal, but by American pressure that exceeded what the relationship could bear. The tariff war that was supposed to strengthen American economic security is now pushing our closest ally toward alternative partnerships. In the next 6 to 12 months, we'll see whether this crack widens or stabilizes. Watch the energy flows. Watch the automotive supply chains. Watch what other allies do when they see that Canada can pivot toward China without immediate catastrophic consequences. The map is changing. The question is whether Washington recognizes it in time to adapt, or whether we'll keep applying pressure that pushes more allies toward the exits. That's the brief. Stay sharp out there.